Good morning, Dan and Amy. So you heard in Mike Scott's news report that Tiny Dancer is set to announce his new police policy of sorts, the hiring of some 500 police officers.
200 detectives.
Right, to clear cases. And have more
Yeah.
manpower for the investigation and resolution of cases, particularly violent crime cases. So I'm glad to see it only took him 6 years to figure out we've got a violent crime problem.
Well, yeah, he let
Chicago.
people know. Yeah, yesterday was on Nightly News that we don't know what's been happening the past few years, but we have a problem here. Oh, really? Thank you. Thank you for just coming to the big table.
It's breaking news.
Wow.
Rahm Emanuel finds out that Chicago has a violent crime problem. And then the issues in Tulsa and Charlotte this weekend. Hillary Clinton in Orlando talking about the economy, but took a moment for an aside to discuss the shootings in Tulsa and Charlotte. And notice what she did.
I'm sending condolences and prayers to their families. I know a lot of you are as well. There is still much we don't know about what happened in both incidents, but we do know that we have 2 more names to add to a list of African Americans killed by police officers in these encounters. It's unbearable, and it needs to become intolerable.
And then she went on to say nice things about police officers don't injure police, like we've seen 16 Charlotte police officers injured over the last couple of days. But kind of undermined by the prefatory statement where she does not distinguish between Charlotte and Tulsa or fact patterns in general in these cases. And there is much to distinguish between the two. You know, we've talked to Dean Angelo, the president of the FOP in Chicago previously. And remember what he said in terms of statistics. Now, look, one person wrongly losing their life, one person being abused by a police officer is one too many. I can see the point. I'm not like the left. I don't treat other people's lives cavalierly. But in Chicago, this year so far, 3,000 civilian-to-civilian shootings, 11 police officer-involved shootings.
Of those 3,000?
No, separate and distinct.
Right, okay.
But, I mean, 11, and in most...
So is that an epidemic? Is that a pandemic? I mean,
right.
No.
Most of those shootings not in controversy, right, in terms of their justification. So the idea, to your use of the word epidemic, which is what a lot of those individuals prosecuting the case against police suggest, boy, I don't know if the evidence merits that description. But for more on this, let's turn to an expert. We're happy to be joined again by Heather MacDonald, scholar at the Manhattan Institute and the author of the best-selling book, The War on Cops. Heather, thanks so much for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on, Dan and Amy. I'm glad to be here.
And so your reaction to the reactions of the with respect to the shootings in Tulsa and Charlotte?
Well, it's the typical ginning up of the narrative again. And as you rightly say, we need to look at these cases in an individual basis, of course. And the families of both victims are grieving and they're facing a horrific reality of their loved ones being killed by the police, and the police rightly face a higher standard than criminals. On the other hand, to have slotted these shootings, in particular the Charlotte shooting, into this false narrative that we have an epidemic of racially biased police shootings is opportunistic, dangerous, as we've seen with the outbreak again of violent anti-cop, anti-white riots in Charlotte, and just completely unacceptable in a public figure.
I mean, here you have Keith Scott's brother calling all white police officers white devils, and all white people in general are white devils. His daughter saying this morning that she believes that the police planted the gun. The way to solve all this, I think, is to release the body cam and dash cam video. But they're not doing that yet. And do you have any idea why they're not doing that? And do you think it would help if they did release it so we could actually see a gun instead of a book?
I don't know. They have a law that takes effect in a week that restricts release of video, but I don't know why they're not doing it now. It does seem like it's very poor strategic decision-making on their part. But the fact of the matter is, Amy, the data simply do not prove, or they dispute, the Black Lives Matter narrative. Blacks in this country are actually killed by the police at a lower rate than their violent crime rates would predict. As you say, in Chicago, over 3,000 people shot. My figures have about 18 officer-involved shootings. The vast majority against suspects who are armed and dangerous. That's 0.6% of the total. And a much larger proportion of white and Hispanic homicide victims died by police shootings than black police shootings. So we've been having this phony narrative about phantom police racism for the past 2 decades in order not to talk about a much more difficult and painful truth, which is the extremely elevated rates of black-on-black crime. That is the way the vast majority of black victims die. And if we could bring that crime rate down, any alleged police problem would simply go away, because policing is an epiphenomenon of crime.
And yeah, I mean, to your point, in Chicago, north of 500 murders this year. 75% of the perpetrators are African American. 75% plus of the victims are African American. So, I mean, in terms of, as you suggest, the rank order of priority of where the problems lie. You have written extensively in your best-selling book, The War on Cops, as well as on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, about the so-called Ferguson Effect. And just kind of explain what you think is happening with police officers in response to this escalating war of words and the fomenting of discord between the populace and police.
Police are backing off of proactive discretionary policing. They are not getting out of their cars to make that discretionary stop at 2 a.m. to question a suspect hanging out on a known drug corner who hitching up his waistband. They don't have to make those stops. They do have to respond to 911 calls, and they're still doing that with alacrity. But having been told by President Obama, Hillary Clinton, the Justice Department, the entire mainstream media, all of academia, and, of course, the violent activists, that they're racist for engaging in proactive policing and public order, low-level enforcement, officers have gotten the message. They're backing off. Additionally, when they do get out of their cars today, they are faced with a level of hatred and vitriol that they've rarely experienced. I was in June in Chicago and talked to an officer who told me he's never experienced so much hatred in his 19 years on the job. He said it's basically an undoable job now.
And just as an aside to that, Eddie Johnson, the African American police chief in Chicago, has been on the job for 3 decades, said exactly the same thing.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
No, I just said Eddie Johnson, our police chief, African American police chief in Chicago, has been on the job for 30 years, said exactly the same thing that you relayed in your encounter with police here.
Well, you know, the Chicago Tribune recorded that 1-hour-long video of a group of kids taunting officers who were investigating a shooting. One of them set off a shooting in an alley just for the fun of seeing cops run in aid of another victim, possibly, and it was all a fake shooting. But when officers back off of proactive policing, and in Chicago, stops were down 82% through July this year, crime goes up in high crime areas because that's where policing is most necessary. So Chicago is the prime example of what I've called the Ferguson Effect. When cops back off, lives are lost. And when they back off, another thing happens. They are ignoring the heartfelt requests of law-abiding residents in those communities for public order. The reason that they cleared the corners, which was a term used by the Justice Department in lambasting Baltimore Police Department for alleged racism, completely unfairly, but the reason cops do try and remove those loitering youth that are hanging out by the dozens, if not hundreds of corners fighting, is because that's out of those knots of loitering youth, drive-by shootings emerge, and the law-abiding residents want them off the street. So the police are in an absolutely impossible situation. If they respond to the desire of the law-abiding residents in their communities for public order, they generate the same racially disproportionate statistics that can be used against them in the next Obama Justice Department or ACLU lawsuit.
So, Heather, you've studied this thoroughly, obviously great work and a wonderful book, but what was the turning point where kids and thugs and gangbangers stopped respecting police?
I'm sorry.
Is there any one?
What was the turning point?
Yeah, is there any one incident in particular that where it flipped, where now kids are playing with police doing this cat and mouse game and just wanting to watch them run away when they hear gunshots? What was the turning point?
Again, I'm having a hard time. What was the turning point in making the police back off? I think that's what you're asking. They're backing off out of just cumulative anger and hostility. But certainly the Black Lives Matter movement, with the false narrative of hands up, don't shoot, that continues to be promulgated by the media, not just by activists, and just the cumulative disorder and hatred, has officers across the country saying you'd have to be crazy to get out of your car to make that stop if you don't have to. When the prosecutions were brought against the 6 officers in Freddie Gray, thank heavens that fabulous judge who followed the law and the evidence rather than the politics of the case acquitted 2 of the officers, and it was clear he was going to acquit the other 3, and there was a hung jury. He followed the law, but the very fact that those indictments were brought that were attempting to criminalize normal policing, that was a blow for officers across the country.
And with a story also out in Chicago this week, in addition to the hiring of more police officers, is Chicago police undergoing required de-escalation training. Now, de-escalation is a part of a police officer's job. You try and de-escalate a situation, not escalate it. But do you see some of this de-escalation training, the move in this direction, as essentially codifying the Ferguson effect?
It could well, and the idea about hiring more cops, that's fine, and vigor is sort of better with police. But unless they are reassured that they will be supported for making proactive policing and for use of force if that force goes awry, and they have not engaged in criminal conduct, 500 more officers isn't going to make much of a difference if they continue driving by disorderly conduct on corners. And the de-escalation techniques, at least that is tactical. What I really object to is something that the President Obama and Hillary Clinton have been foisting on, and Attorney General Lynch have been foisting on departments, which is implicit bias training, which is a complete fraud based on the utterly false idea that we're living through an epidemic of racially biased shootings. If de-escalation works on communication skills, that would be a good thing. But what officers are really desperate for is hands-on tactical training. I talked to an officer in Chicago who actually pays for his own training in making those agonizing split-second judgments about shoot, don't shoot. That's what officers need.
All right. She is Heather MacDonald, a scholar at the Manhattan Institute, the author of the book, the best-selling book, The War on Cops. Heather, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you again, Dan and Amy. I'm honored to be on.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.